and here we are with two Bay Area composers. We're very, very pleased to be able to bring them to the stage tonight, Ryan Brown and Vivian Fung. So please welcome them both. And my name is Eric Dudley. We would love to hear from both of you. Is there a kind of a inspiration or genesis or germinal moment for these pieces in each of your mind? How did they start off?
Twist is actually in three movements, and the three movements are twisted prelude, twisted PIPA, and twisted jam. And it's really my sort of twist, quote unquote, on different traditions of guitar music. And so the twisted prelude stems from Baroque guitar. Twisted PIPA actually stems from the non-Western, more court Chinese music. And then twisted jam is my sort of hybrid take of just jams you find in maybe pop music or rock music. So that's essentially it.
I was commissioned by a group called Janus, which is flute, viola, and harp. And I was living on the East Coast at the time. I wrote this piece in 2009. And this was actually the second piece I wrote for them. The first piece I wrote did actually use the flute, and it was way too complicated. They played it great, but it just sounded too busy. It sounded too composerly. You know, it was trying too hard, really, is what it was. But they wanted to record it, and something about the finality of it being recorded made me kind of panic, as I often do, and be, no, I don't like it enough. I'll write you something else quickly, you know, and it won't be hard, I promise, and record this one instead. And it was great because I felt like I got a lot out in that first piece and felt less pressure. And at the same time, I was working with some fellow composers on writing reactions to an album by Björk, the Icelandic artist Björk, called Vespertine, the album Vespertine, which is her fourth album. And it's a beautiful, beautiful album, if you don't know it, and it's themed around ideas of domesticity. And in particular, she was interested in creating modern chamber music, which I thought was a great concept, and particularly the idea that people used to be at home and play music for each other, including the harp. And so her album has a lot of harp, but it also combines electronics in a very subtle way and a lot of whispery sounds. It's meant to be, this was 2001, the album came out, so it was actually written with the iPod in mind, so it was meant to be a very intimate, in-the-ear experience. And so I thought, well, here's a very interesting pop, electronica, rock, I mean, she's unclassifiable genre-wise, trying to, her hand at modern chamber music, and here I am being asked to write chamber music. What if I made it sound more, what if Björk and I met in a room, which would be amazing, But I also wanted to take some of her idea of, I knew the piece wouldn't have electronics, but what if I tried to replicate some electronica type sounds just subtly in the piece? So that's why there's a little bit of fingernail buzz, and there's the strings, and there's just, different types of things. And I'm sorry, but I really don't like the flute. And so, I had the flutist actually bang on the harp instead of playing her instrument, and luckily she was totally into it. So she never touches the flute in the whole piece, as you saw. Luckily tonight we have our percussionist doing it, and he's great. And luckily that flutist was very game to just play percussion.
You have a player sitting right next to another player, playing on the same instrument, active in the same space where they are, and sometimes it could produce a little bit of chaos,
yeah,
right?
Well, I can try and justify it retroactively by saying that goes with the intimacy theme, right? It's like they're very intimate, and also the idea of we're at, and I've done this in other pieces too, of just we're at home. What if these musicians are just at home and you just play with whatever's at hand? Yeah. So I have some pieces that are for a handful of coat hangers that you kind of make an ambient sound, kind of like in this. And similar thing, what if, you know, the percussionist didn't have a lot of percussion and just let me come over and jam on your instrument, you know?
Yeah, and of course the specificity of sound of a lot of those elements is also very important to you. I know from your other music, we're doing a long work of Ryan's called Mortal Lessons further on towards the spring, and there's a passage in that where several players just play on paper in the same style of Hans Abrahamsson's Schnee, which was on the SFCMP season earlier this year. And the sound in your piece tonight of the paper against the strings, I know we spent some significant time in rehearsal just to get that right, to get it the way that you want it to sound.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard for me in moments like that to not make it a gimmick, but to really, you know, there really is a specific sound in mind, but it's a fine line, I think, with compositions sometimes where you're going for a unique sound and it can cross over into feeling a little too on the nose or feeling a little gimmicky. There is a musical impulse behind it, I think.
And so in Vivian, in your piece, it's especially perhaps in the twisted PIPA movement, there you're using some very specific instrumental techniques to try and recall the sound of that instrument, right?
Yeah, I think it's a very visceral sort of, there are a lot of string contact sounds that I use for the guitar. So instead of just plucking a note, the guitarist will swipe the strings, and that produces a sort of, it recalls something from a past era. Harmonics is another thing. A lot of glissandi, pitch bends. So a lot of notes that are kind of in between one pitch and another pitch. I love that, that in-betweenness is something so, there's a whole world in there, and I love exploring that. So there are a lot of those kind of techniques in the second movement, and it's very soft, ethereal, a lot of, these swishes, glisses, pitch bends, harmonics that recall a different era, and that recollection is what I'm after.
Is there a particular kind of emotional sphere or memory sphere that you are each reacting to or acting on when you went about composing these pieces? In other words, what do they evoke in you emotionally, both at the time of writing and also when you finished writing and then put it in the hands of performers?
So for me, I think it's reacting to a tradition, because I wasn't really, guitar is not my primary instrument, and it was something that I came to and started really loving. And so I really wanted to explore the different aspects of guitar writing. And the three movements are reactions to what I heard. And the intimacy of the guitar with violin, you can really hear that in the middle movement. And then also the sort of preluding, sort of quasi-improving of the first movement. And then the third movement is just as raucous as a guitar and violin can be. And so just exploring those different sound worlds, I think, is, and at the same time being in my own voice and having it be distinct from that. Yeah.
I'm lucky if one in every 4 or 5 pieces I manage to write something that just feels very authentic and doesn't feel overly pretentious or overly, too cerebral. And I feel like with this one, if it's just about being beautiful and joyful and being very on the sleeve about that, that works for me, as long as it has an element of strangeness to it, which I always try and, accessible, strange but accessible is my, slogan. So I like that it, to me, captured what I love about the Bjork album, which is that kind of fragile, strange beauty, but not sappy, not saccharine. And then at the end, it's just that human quality of just, it's fun to hear people clap, It's just something anthemic about it, especially if it's kind of raw, and that amateur, old-time, home, domestic chamber music quality.
When it comes to the actual composition itself, this is a kind of a 2-part question. What were some of the aspects that were most on your mind as you set about actually writing the pieces? And because of that, or maybe as a result of that, how do you feel, if at all, you were able to kind of press forward a little bit in the compositional process yourself? Are there any kind of innovations to your own personal language and style that result as a part of these the composition process of these pieces?
I try to, in my own world, in my own language, try to explore as much as possible the idiom of guitar writing as much as possible, and really get into the different sort of strumming techniques, and even borrowing from Spanish guitar and all the different sort of strums that are possible, the different sort of touches that are possible with the guitar. I really got into it. I mean, in such a detailed way. And if you actually look at the score, there are actually Jason did a lot of fingerings and edits and a lot of different sort of things that he added to it, and it was like a sort of a collaboration in that sense. And I guess it's inevitable for guitar writing to have that. And actually, there was one technique in the second movement where he actually crosses the strings, so it produces sort of a deadening of the strings, and that's really, I think, really cool and something that you can listen out for. It's actually towards the end. So. Right.
So would you say now that after that process, are you ready to go out and write a guitar concerto of your own? And
maybe with the right collaboration, maybe. Yeah, and with the right orchestra, maybe, because
exactly.
I mean, balance is always an issue with guitar, and I think you need a really sensitive orchestra to be able to pull that off, or really good miking, I guess. But even with the famous guitar concertos, there's always going to be an issue.
Yep.
So
it's always a decision. It's either the orchestra has to pare down to the point where the instrument can shine through acoustically, or you just go Steve Mackey direction and say, I'm going to write for electric guitar amplified,
exactly,
and that's what it's going to be.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Also, how much were you concentrating on the moment-to-moment interplay between just these two artists?
You have one that is, acoustically, the guitar is a very intimate feel, and then violin is basically a melodic instrument that can only, do so many notes at a time. So you're almost looking at, pairing, a singer with accompaniment, almost, but it's a chamber music. And so it's a very intimate feel to it, and so that I react to that as well, and the sort of intimacy and the closeness and the personalness of it. So, and I love that aspect too, which is a big contrast to some of the other works that I do of big orchestral pieces. The collective has a sound, not just guitar and violin, but the combination of the two melding together, I think, is also very important.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the third movement does that. There's a lot of interplay between the two instruments, going back and forth with material, and so it becomes a unit. Yeah.
And there's also a bit of a tension created in the piece, where even right from the outset of the first movement, they both start off with 16th note intervals together, right? And then very quickly diverge into their own rhythmic world.
It's about finding how much kind of the brain versus heart kind of balance. How much of the brain do I need to put in where I'm not overshadowing one or the other, and I'm happy in this piece with that balance. For example, to get kind of technical for a moment, I do a lot of pieces where I'll do kind of a pattern with the meter changes ahead of time, just as a grid. I'll kind of make a grid first and then compose the music such that it has to fit in that grid, and the material is not incidental, but I kind of decide ahead of time. It's like, I always think of it like a painter stretching the canvas first. And for me, I like to play these kind of number games and stuff in the meters. And then the material can kind of warp around it, and that's how this piece is for me. And I like this idea that was a breakthrough in this piece. If I can take something very cerebral like that, 6 minutes of this meter number game, and put some very, very diatonic music over it, but if it has to warp with the meter, then that gives that material its own kind of unsteadiness. And it has to, if it's a kind of what I think of as, a simpler material, with a more complicated grid. That's a nice pairing, but if both things are complicated, it can be too much. It's that kind of balance, you know.
You'll hear even more of that kind of rhythmic interplay, the way that the accents are shifted around. And if you were to try and pulse it in a regular meter and actually just count to 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 throughout the whole time, you'll hear how those accents are constantly shifting around. And that's the interplay in the piece. What I think is so cool then is that when the clapping comes in toward the end, and it's something that we perceive then as being a kind of a regular thing, that it's like, oh yeah, it's a clap along kind of rhythm, that kind of puts a totally different spin on it.
Yeah, and that was a spot where, you know, it could, most clapping, hopefully if you're good at a concert and you're clapping along, you're clapping on 2 and 4, not on 1 and 3. So the clapping is basically on beats 2 and 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But because every so often there's a 5/4 in there, that doesn't work, and so the clapping has to accommodate that by doing a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it has to get back on, you know. So I liked that decision being made for me, and then being able to decide whether I like the result of that or not. You know, when do you jump into the machine and tweak the results, and when do you let the machine kind of have its own life?
If there's something you would like for us to take away as listeners from these pieces, what is that thing? What is the thing that you're hoping we're left with as an overall impression of these works? Probably the hardest question, actually.
I think for me, it's just the beauty of the pairing of guitar and violin together, and the different, but also the different, the range that can be produced as a result. And I hope that that I explored some of it. There's so many sounds that can be. It's a developing repertoire, but I think the two is a very special combination.
I think my comment relates more to contemporary music in general, and this is going to sound way too grandiose, and I'm very, very sorry. But it's just a reminder that sometimes what we love about music is just a good tune and rhythm and beauty, and that's good and that's okay. And I think, you know, sometimes in contemporary music we try and put a lot of this stuff between us and the audience, and I think Vivian's piece and hopefully mine have a sense of intimacy of get up, and these are, you know, you really hear two people in her case, and in mine other things of just, it's an experience that we all get to have together, and it's okay to be drawn in and not, you know, overthinking it too much.